everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, introducing the new DFIR Hunt Evil poster. My name is Carol Auth of the SANS Institute, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speakers are Rob Lee and Mike Pilkington. Both are SANS instructors. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Rob.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rob Lee. I'm the SANS DFIR curriculum lead, instructor, course author for 500 and 508. I want to welcome you today to the webcast we're doing on our brand new poster, which is an update to our blue poster, which we affectionately call it the Find Evil poster, that we now updated to a brand new site called Hunt Evil. And today on the webcast with me is Mike Pilkington. Say hi, Mike.
Hello, everyone.
And Mike's going to be jumping back and forth with me, going through the different sections that we updated on the poster and kind of step through. One note, if you notice on this initial slide that we have here, there is and there's also on the title slide too, that if you would like to receive the brand new poster, if you're not going to be attending a SANS event upcoming here, you could actually request one by going to the link that you see here. And using your SANS portal account, there's a quick request poster, little nugget that's going to be in there, and one will be dropped in the mail to you, I think, in about 3 or 4 weeks. I don't think it's immediate. I think they're going to first collect it, all the posters, and do one massive poster mailer that's going to be going out to everyone. I also think that poster is going to be in the they call it a ride-along, but I think it's going to be with one of the SANS catalogs. But a lot of people may miss it in the SANS catalog and kind of like to have it. Yep, I got my poster there. So we'll kick things off officially. So this poster is one of these posters that kind of is universal across many of our courses. And I don't know if you guys have seen all of our brand new coins, which are on this updated slide as well for all of our different courses. But this poster definitely has a lot of relations to the network forensics, 572, 508, cyber threat intelligence, 504 for hacker exploits and so forth, in addition to just standard Windows forensics. So all of our posters that we have here kind of tied together, that we have a lot of artifacts that are from one poster to the other. And before we kick things off, I kind of wanted to tie this together that we have our Windows artifact analysis poster, evidence of, and we have these different categories. One of the categories is this massive program execution row, which actually is mirrored on one of the sides of the new Hunt Evil poster. And we do that intentionally just to be able to say, hey, when you look at some of these artifacts, where are they from? What do they mean? That way you could refer to the actual artifact location and know exactly what the correct interpretation is for a lot of the artifacts that we're going to be discussing on the poster. So the two sides that we have on the poster that we're going to be starting to go through here is the really trying to identify on a standard Windows system, anomalistic things that potentially might catch your eye. The idea here is that we're really not trying to create an IOC or something like that, but we're basically trying to categorize standard things that adversaries might do, or even internal bad guys might do to be able to freely move around your network or potentially start different processes and hide in plain sight. And as a result of that, this poster becomes a really invaluable reference that you could always refer back to potentially identify what you think might be normal and see if there's any anomalistic characteristics about it. And we'll give you some examples as we dive into this. So I'm going to kick it over to Mike. And Mike is going to discuss his update to the Windows process side that he did and some of the new things that he discovered and completely different about Windows 10 compared to Windows 7. And there's some things that when I initially was exposed to, I really sat back and said, wow, that's amazing when you start taking a look at it. So Mike, all you.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Rob. So we did a few things here to try to update this poster, and it has been kind of a cornerstone to part of our 508 class, and particularly around the memory forensics section, where we use it to figure out what's normal that are supposed to be there, what processes launch other processes, what are the command line parameters and things of that nature. So this just gave us opportunity. We've been on our to-do list for a while, but update it with Windows 10. And so what we did is a few things here to try to capture what's changed with the latest operating systems. Kind of set up a small little test domain with Windows 10 Enterprise. So the process listing you'll see in a moment is from Windows 10 Enterprise version of the operating system. We actually had a domain connected with a server, 2016 server. So as far as the lateral movement and the usage of accounts and alternate accounts and things of that nature, they were all domain accounts that were used in this testing. Also importantly, these are just really stock installs. In other words, there's no tweaking of the Windows auditing or logging settings. It's basically all the default that's in Windows 10. We also had the ability to take advantage of a deployment of an EDR tool and about 100 or so, over 100 Windows 10 systems, so that as we were doing the testing in our environment, we could also kind of cross-check it against kind of actual data that's being used in a live environment. Of course, a foundation for any Windows analysis should be Windows internals books, and so we use the latest version of Windows internals, 7th edition, to kind of understand some of these processes, what their purpose is, and things of that nature. And then also a shout out to Jason Boston for his presentation, Windows Exploratory Surgery with Process Hacker. That is still an excellent presentation. I don't think he's updated it for Windows 10, but you can find the Windows 7 version online, and it's still very useful and very entertaining as well. So those are just some of the process or some of the resources we used for this analysis. So Rob, let's talk about the no normal side. So this is the kind of like a side one, but this is going to be talking about the processes that are running in a Windows system generally and normally. All right, so naturally we start with SVCHOST, right? I mean, this is the attacker's fan favorite for blending in amongst the crowd. As you see on the left, this is the screenshot that's from the poster, and looks very similar to our old one. It's got a layout of, the kind of the parent-child relationship, kind of a tree view of the processes. And it's got a few more processes than before. Actually, I'll get into that in a moment, but I'll note that this is specifically Windows 10 Enterprise with 3 gig of memory. And here in just a moment, I'll tell you why that's important. But just an overview of SVCHOST, make sure everybody's on the same page here. It's of course the main process for running services. Most of our services are implemented as service DLLs, and those DLLs are generally run under the SVCHOST process. And so traditionally what Windows has done is kind of bundled multiple services with the same security requirements into a single instance of SVCHOST, and it uses that -k parameter to kind of group them into similar requirements. So typically on a Windows host, you might have 100 services running, but only maybe a dozen instances of SVCHOST running because they'll group them together. And that's done for kind of efficiency purposes, right? So you don't have to have lots of different SVCHOST processes running. Now, that is the way that Windows has behaved for years and years. And in fact, even up until Windows 10 version 1703, I believe that was the creator's update. With that version, we actually saw a change in how Windows handled SVCHOST. And they made the decision that if a system has more than 3.5 gig of memory, it's actually not going to group those services into kind of just a handful of SVCHOST instances. It's actually going to basically provide a unique instance of SVCHOST for each running service. All right, so let's go ahead and show you that on the next slide. I've kind of got a different screenshot here for you to show you what a typical Windows system is going to look like, Windows 10 system is going to look like. And I say typical because probably most Windows 10 systems are going to have basically at least 4 gig of memory. or more. And if that's the case, and you open up Process Explorer or Task Manager, you're going to see lots and lots of SVC host instances. In fact, did a couple little commands there in PowerShell and found that in this instance there were 60 running SVC host processes on this host. And so that's pretty interesting. Now, malware authors have loved to be able to blend in with the noise of SVC hosts because there's typically, a dozen or so running. Well, now it's even easier to blend in because there might be, 5 or 6 dozen of them running. And so that's something we've just got to be aware of, and a little bit of a difference with the newest version of Windows 10. Also, a change here that is noted is that traditionally, all of your SVC host processes were running as a local built-in service account, either the system account or the network service or local service account. Well, now there's actually 6, and they're actually documented, and we have notes in the PDF that we'll distribute with this webcast. There's a link to this, but there are 6 specific user-based services that are running on Windows 10 now by default. So you will typically find, in this case, there's one of those service hosts actually groups together 4 services, and so in other words, we'll have roughly 6 services running under 3 different instances of SVC host as end user accounts, and that's pretty unusual, a little different than before. So something to be aware of there. All right, let's take a look at the next one. The next one is just a neat feature worth kind of exploring in Windows 10, and this is the idea of kind of virtualization-based security, which provides an additional security boundary through the use of hardware virtualization. Pretty cool capability. There are several new features that take advantage of this. We list there Credential Guard as well as Device Guard. Another one that you might be familiar with is Application Guard, which is now kind of integrated with Edge and Internet Explorer so that you can open untrusted websites effectively in a VM or virtualized container. So really cool technology that's available. Now, with respect to Credential Guard, we focused in on this one just because credentials are such an important part of incident response. And, we want to understand as best we can how to safeguard our credentials, and utilizing Credential Guard is definitely a best practice at this point. Now, when Credential Guard's enabled, kind of at the bottom left, you're going to see actually 2 related processes. One of them is LSA-ISO or LSA-ISO, and that's the new process that takes over some of the functionality of LSASS. So these 2 processes now work kind of in tandem to handle authentication and to basically safeguard your credentials. LSA-ISO essentially runs at what's called a virtual trust level of 1, a higher virtual trust level, and it's effectively separated through virtualization hardware, and it stores your credentials. LSASS becomes kind of a proxy and essentially handles incoming authentication requests, passes it to LSA-ISO, which takes an authentication challenge, answers it, provides the answer back to LSASS, which then kind of finishes out the authentication. This is kind of cool. It's really very, very helpful in helping safeguard those credentials, keep those credentials in a protected container. But what's important kind of just to keep in mind is as you deploy this, you might start seeing, or you will see LSA-ISO.exe on your Windows processes. Conversely, from a malware perspective, if malware is trying to hide and blend in and look at LSA-ISO, you should recognize that there would never be more than one. And in fact, if you don't have Credential Guard enabled, you shouldn't see any, right? And so you can bet that attackers at some point are going to target that process and try to look like it's a legitimate process when in fact it's actually malicious.
Hey, Mike, quick question. And one of the things that I don't know if everyone knows, but Mike's done a lot of research on how to protect your credentials from standard bad guy attacks that are out there. And he's and while I'm pretty familiar with most of them, he's one of the ones I turn to ask really detailed questions on it. But What are, from your opinion, from credential guard, don't go into 30 minutes because you easily could do so, but
yeah.
What is the impact of credential guard? What type of attacks will it thwart that a lot of attackers are currently using today?
It's designed to protect all of our credentials, so including a Kerberos ticket, so it would thwart past the hash, or past the ticket, or NTLM protect past the hash type of attacks. Everything I've read is that once it's in the protected environment, it's very effective at protecting those credentials. The downside, though, is you're probably familiar with this, but just make sure everyone is. There has been one kind of vulnerability that's been exposed in the last 6 months or so, and of course it was from Benjamin Del P, who created Mimikatz. But there's a little bit of an exposure, but an important exposure point between the time that a user enters their credentials into the keyboard to log on interactively to a system to the time it actually gets kind of held into LSA ISO. And effectively that LSASS process has access to the password during that point between typing in the key, the password, and getting it stored. So there's a feature in Mimikatz that will actually allow what's called a security service provider to be stored on the system and log that password. In fact, actually log it to a file on disk. So this is not, at this point, unfortunately, a foolproof mechanism. There are some, now I haven't been able to test this, but there are some features of Windows, for example, Windows Hello, and some of the newer drivers that actually basically provide the entire path from entering credentials. In that case, it could be biometric credentials through a hardware driver that's implemented as a isolated virtual secure boundary straight into LSAS or LSA ISO. So long and short of it is there's some it's kind of a path forward to doing it securely from what I've read, and that's effectively using kind of Windows Hello and biometrics and proper hardware with the drivers being implemented with this virtual-based security methodology. So kind of a long-winded answer there, but I have to acknowledge that there is vulnerability with Windows right now, even with Credential Guard enabled, and that is that path when we're still using passwords and literally typing the passwords into the system, that there's an exposure at that point. And that's actually documented by Windows. It's not a surprise to them. It's really we have to get to a point to where effectively all the hardware that we're using is supported this virtualization technology and provides safeguards those credentials through that whole path.
Awesome.
All right, so the last one here, we'll kind of deep dive, just because again it's kind of a newer one, and it's not super new. It's around in Windows 8, but this idea of app containers, and app containers again came around in Windows 8, still here in Windows 10, and the idea is to provide kind of a modular process architecture so that it actually serves a couple purposes. One, it improves portability across different hardware device types and operating system versions, and it also improves security, which is nice. And of course, this app containers had a lot of different names. It was Metro apps for a while, the modern apps and immersive apps and things of that nature. And you often see now this Universal Windows Platform app. That's kind of the name I see most commonly these days. But there are a lot of interesting aspects to app containers, but from a no normal perspective, probably the most interesting thing for us to keep in mind is the fact that for each of these app container processes, they typically have to have a broker process that runs in tandem with them. And that's because by default, the app containers have very limited permissions. And so essentially this broker process, which is typically runtime broker.exe, provides kind of some additional access for these apps. And so often, most often you're going to see one of these runtime broker.exes actually launch with the app container app as well. So yeah, the example we give there is like, for example, if you launch calculator.exe, there'll be a corresponding runtime broker.exe process to initiate. And there's a number of apps now that are using app container or kind of these immersive apps, including Skype and Cortana and Edge, and certainly there'll be more to come. So so when we see these apps run, we expect to see the corresponding runtime broker process, and consequently, we should expect to see malware authors take advantage of this. Basically hiding is yet another runtime broker.exe, much as they do with hiding as another SVCHOST.exe process. So that's kind of a few of the new and interesting features of Windows 10 that would be worth highlighting. But of course, we go into more detail and additional processes, quite a few additional processes on the poster.
All right, so I'm going to take over the initially kicking off the Honeywell side. So when we were initially redesigning the poster, we had a lot of the initial backside of the poster kind of had a big smorgasbord of different things that you want to look for, and we decided to on this major update to make it a lot more targeted. So we ended up taking a lot of the thought process behind what is one of the soft underbellies that, despite the APT group flavor of the week, that most APTs that if they're functioning inside a Windows environment are going to have to traverse. And that area actually, I kind of make fun of it a little bit, calling it the, that despite how advanced an APT is or how unskilled they are, they all will have to move laterally across the Windows environment. And this is, again, we're debating whether we do one on credential theft or one on different anti-forensics techniques, and these actually might lay the foundation for additional future posters. But we decided to say, well, let's just take the standard Windows paths of communication from inside an enterprise that adversaries are usually going to try to take advantage of after they gain access to some sort of credentials. It doesn't have to be admin level credentials. They could actually be doing a lot of the stuff even in standard users. But we found that regardless of if malware is used, there's always the ability to remotely exploit another system inside the environment. But typically we see adversaries kind of laterally move using natural techniques, and a lot of groups out there call this the living off the land principle. And we can't go, very far without, kind of mentioning here that when we start talking about, how an adversary might move around your environment, obviously the assumption is they have to gain some sort of authority in your, this is after Spearfish, they gain access to the system, executing some code, and then they're gonna, try to do some sort of credential theft. And that's why, Mike leading off in that the credential guard processes and more. It's kind of a very interesting, how do we detect access to credential theft? And this is, again, a lot of forensic artifacts do exist, and we cover a lot in our courses, but it's one of these that we decided focusing completely on the different paths for adversaries are going to be able to use across the environment. So so let's assume that someone's going to be accessing a system A to system B across the environment. There's a couple in there, remote desktop services and accessing Windows admin shares, that when we ended up taking a look at how two different systems communicate with each other, we always have the source system and we also have the target system. The target system is where they're moving to. The source system is where they're moving from. And oftentimes in an enterprise environment, it's both systems will exist there, but it's not all the time. In some cases, they're actually tunneling from external environment. So it's not always guaranteed that we're actually going to have access to the source system. But luckily, a lot of in our environments, they actually are doing island hopping from system to system to system across the enterprise. So in many cases, the source system does exist because they're hopping from it to another host. And that could have been 3 hops in at that point. So you always have the source and dest. So I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but what we really try to break down into 3 different categories. When you look at the poster, there's the event logs, there's the registry, and also there's the file system. Now, we can't go very far here because there's a couple of resources out there that we also ended up utilizing and comparing notes against when we were creating this. The first is the MITRE's attack format, the ATT-CNK the adversary tools, techniques, and common knowledge database that MITRE has done an exceptional job keeping up to date with, and how lateral movement is categorized there. We also have to do a huge nod to the JP CERT, who's done a massive dump of a lot of the different techniques that adversaries use in lateral movement, including categorization of many credential theft malware in addition to standard malware used for anti-forensics. But we basically said, well, let's focus only on living off the land techniques and not dive into utilization of like S-delete or something like that, like JP CERT does. And that, that document is extremely well documented. So huge hat to them. Now, what we ended up doing here is basically breaking down to 3 categories of forensics categories to look for evidence: the event logs, your registry high files, and then of course, anything that is going to exist on the file system as a result of any type of these techniques that are going to be in play here. As a result of that, there's a lot of new forensic artifacts that exist, recently been discussed, even in the past 2 to 3 months, such as the background activity moderator, the BAM key that you see listed there, where you actually will see the execution of the mstc.exe. So you notice in here, for a lot of this, you're looking for that universal evidence of execution marker, which again, on the source system, if on this where mstsc is being executed, any of these locations, if it's a GUI program or not, will show. Now, if it's a non-GUI program, you'll probably not see the user assist or the recent apps registry keys being listed there, because those only track GUI level applications. But since RDP is a GUI level application, you'll usually see this from system A to system B. But notice on the file system, we also get some really interesting artifacts there from the jump list, the prefetch, and the bitmap cache, where you're able to pull out different things that were drawn on the screen as a result of the remote desktop session. Now, one of the really fascinating things on the registry and file system side is that between recent apps, registry key, and the jump list, you actually can independently identify the systems that they're remoted into by looking at the recent items and recent apps, as well as the jump lists, which are going to detail the actual IP addresses or system names that they remoted into. And of course, on the event logs should also record this, but many event logs will potentially rotate. The registry and file system, a lot of those details have a lot longer time horizon of existence that might exist a lot longer period of time than potentially what you might have for event log rotation. So again, this is just a general categorization of what you'll see on the source side. On the destination side, for the target side, we end up seeing a lot more event logs that are going to be generated as a result of this. You end up seeing the log on type 10, the 4778, 4779. These event logs are going to detail the IPs of the source, system name, for example. There's a lot of custom event logs that are also generated in there that Mike has done an exceptional job of doing additional testing on, just to double check that these event logs still show a lot of stuff, even on the Windows 10 side. But if you also look on the registry side and the file system, one of the ways you could always tell that someone's remote desktop into the system is the execution of RDP clip and TS theme.exe, in both the prefetch and the shim cache. Both of those will exist if the system has ever accepted a remote desktop session, which is really cool. Mike, any additional things you want to say on either the source or desk side before I move on? Anything that you tested that you found particularly interesting?
Well, I always just find jump lists so fascinating, because there's such a long history can be stored in those jump lists from the source side, and including the remote IP address or host name listed in there for as far as I know, there's no end time to to how many events it'll store in there, and then the recent apps being very similar to that too. So it's really cool to see that level of effectively logging what's happening on the source system. Speaking of logging, I was going to just mention though that one thing that we did leave out of all these source events is the idea of kind of process tracking or a sysmon type logging, which is obviously incredibly useful. But we could have basically put that on every single one of these source or destination for that matter. But we just made a note in the poster that that can provide additional, obviously critical in some cases, logging and visibility, but it's not something we are including here. just for brevity's sake.
We actually had, I remember you and I had a long discussion on that, because it ends up being one of these, it feels like it's always there, but we always just put the overall note at the top, basically saying, hey, if you turn this on, you get additional telemetry, but this is not going to definitely be there by default. And we're saying what will be there by default is kind of the general thing. And then if you want to turn on additional telemetry, we definitely recommend the process tracking, the command line tracking through that, which is another option you could enable through that in addition to the sysmon capability. So you're exactly right.
Yeah. And one thing I've noticed about this, and you've said this before, I've noticed it too, but in the past, I've enabled process tracking in prior environments where I've worked, and we've had really good success with it. But I have noticed that with Windows 10, maybe partly because we have so many more instances of processes, including these runtime brokers and many more instances of SVCHOST, that there are a lot more events being logged with process tracking. I was actually looking at it today, and I did an analysis of my host system. I have like 2 million events, and literally 3/4 of them are process tracking events, which kind of blew me away because I really hadn't done that kind of statistical analysis lately. And that's a huge number of events from process tracking.
And one of the questions I usually get from a lot of people on it, again, hopefully this will take a question out of a lot of people for, even listening in right now, is that how large should we make our security event logs? And my answer right now is like, minimum is a gig, 1 gig as a minimum, and then I would definitely go as large as you could potentially get. I would say in some cases try to even get 5 gigs or larger if even possible. But I would say I wouldn't at this point, because hard drives are it's massive amount of data there. We definitely could say we could do 5 gigs or more.
Disk space is cheap.
Space is cheap. All right, so the next one we look at is, connecting from a net share, and we actually show the command line here that, you see a typical attacker or even someone internally do. But the reason I mention this is a lot of people say, well, why would you, a lot of people do this, right? And I said, yeah, but they're usually admins who would do this, where they're connecting to the critical connectors of $, admin, especially those two, if they're going to copy malware from system A to system B. Now, I always make a joke when I'm in class. I said, how often do you think that you're going to have a user, like Jill in HR, connect to Joan's system in finance using a net use command, using an admin-enabled account from system A to system B? And this is where this becomes, that'd be extremely rare. It's rare enough that they drop to a command prompt, but it's even more rare that they're connecting to $, shares. Now, this is something you might see from the sysadmin enclave, from those potentially on the tech side, power users, but those individuals are fairly limited inside your environment. And so the large line share of the average employees or individuals and users in your administration that you're looking for are likely not connecting to remote shares like this, especially through the command prompts. If they're doing, lateral movement, saying I'm going to connect to a remote share, it's usually because they already have a public share mapped. But again, that's, if you create a heat map, you're going to be able to identify, that all the systems communicate with this one file server, so we can eliminate that from suspicion. Let's look for potential other lateral movement detections of mapping to admin $. And again, you start to see here, one of the things I always point out for the net use command is that 2 commands are always going to be logged on the source system, is net and net1. Net1 is a child process of net that is always going to be instantiated on it, which is interesting because I've actually seen adversaries, they've gone and cleaned up and removed the evidence of execution from prefetch for net.exe, but didn't hit net1. And so, both of these will be executed at the same time. I'm like, well, they're clearly not forensics educated, because they would have known that both of those two things are the brother-sister, parent-child process that you're always going to see at that point in time. The other thing you end up seeing is usually on the source system side, and you also see this in the remote desktop, type environments as well. You potentially have to look for this. Is the when someone mounts remote share, they're usually going to be browsing through it through the desktop session, like via interactive session such as RDP. You will actually see them browse from the different folders on the source system side that we're looking at here. So you'll be able to see the network name, the share name, and everything else that they're connecting to on the shellbacks, which is evidence of folder access, which is really useful to us. On the opposite side, on the target side, again, a plethora of event logs that are created as a result of this. Again, if you have it enabled, the 5140 and 5145 for auditing the share access is entirely useful. They're usually recommended from a security standpoint, but typically you're looking for the 4672 logon. Now, one thing that's interesting here is that if they're using a passive hash style attack, which again is fairly limited on Windows 10 systems, if you're using some of the latest security protections, protecting the protected users group and so forth, it will restrict anyone logging in an admin-enabled account from another system. And that's kind of an interesting aside there, because you typically on a Windows 7 system would see the 4776, which is the NTLM authentication. And you would never see this in an enterprise environment where you have an admin user logging in locally, authenticating locally and connecting to an admin or a $C$ share. It's what I call the 3-alarm fire, is that you see a logon type 3, network logon, using an admin-enabled account, 4672, using a local authentication. And again, if you're monitoring this to the SIM, that should be an alert that should pop up and say, hey, you should at least go validate that, because it's such a rare occurrence, except for if you're a bad guy, that you're going to be able to take a look at that. All right, I'm going to go on to the next couple here. So next couple are also kind of interesting when we get into like, what are they doing? How, like in the remote systems, they can copy malware on the first two, but then just copying the malware is not enough. They're going to usually have to interact with the remote system to force it to execute a program on the remote side, or to cause some sort of instruction to be done. And in the last three categories in here, we have PSEXEC, Windows Remote Management Tools, PowerShell remoting, and of course, down at the bottom, the vulnerability exploitation. But that's one of the ones we don't cover, obviously, in our poster, because that's a straight exploit that had different forensic residue. But one of the ones we end up seeing here is like PSEXEC, which is still to this day one of the most popular tools that's downloaded from sysinternals to remote systems. Generally, you never see a normal user ever decide to use PSEXEC. And in fact, I make a big joke into modern environments that you've not switched over to complete doing PowerShell remoting, and you have to wean the administrators off of PSEXEC in some cases. But PSEXEC is one of those highly insecure, use it at your own risk, only know if you know what you're doing style tools, because it has a huge potential for exposing the credentials on the remote system to an adversary. Even if you're using it for good, because it's in many cases it's carrying over the token or the hash or a lot of other things that could be stolen by the remote attacker, and you're basically handing over admin-enabled tokens and credentials to a remote adversary by using PSEXEC. So don't use PSEXEC for instant response or remote admin. I usually say start switching over to PowerShell if you can. But we know adversaries still use it, and good for them, because there's a plethora, and I mean a really large amount of artifacts that are created as a result of PSEXEC. Now, this is just on the source side. You obviously see the execution, evidence of execution that are going to be recorded in here. But it's on the target side that we end up seeing a massive amount of artifacts that are related to this. You see the service for PSEXEC service being installed. You see a new file in the admin $ directory for the PSEXEC service is going to be dropped in there. You're going to see the PSEXEC service and potentially the evil.exe prefetch files created in the prefetch directory itself. Obviously, you're going to be, you see the 464, 4672 logon that's going to occur. And of course, you see the service creation. And anytime you see a service creation on a system, there's a massive amount of really difficult to remove artifacts that an adversary would potentially have to wrestle with a little bit here. But it's an extremely noisy tool, and it's good for us from a forensics perspective, because if you've weaned your administrators off of it, any use of PSEXEC in your environment should be immediately flagged for investigations. Mike, you've done a lot of research on this. Anything you want to add?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's just as noisy as it can be, which is awesome for us from a investigative standpoint. The other thing I always love to see is when the attacker gets interactive access. They love to have a desktop in front of them and RDP or some other technology to do that. It's great for them, but awesome for us as well, because we just lights up like a Christmas tree, all the activity we see from it as a result.
And we can't go very far here without talking about a lot of the Windows remote management tools that also exist. Again, all of these are command line executables where you never see, again, Joe, sitting on his desk, average user, dropping to a command prompt and executing SC or at or scheduled task or reg. It's just simply not happening. It's like, again, I'm not saying impossible. It is just, it is unlikely that you start seeing average user drop to it. And we're not talking power users or sysadmins. Again, you could potentially eliminate those for investigations, but just even the execution of a lot of these tools on the host system should potentially, cause a cause for alarm. When I was at Mandate, one of the things that, when the initial versions of Redline came out, I noticed that one of the IOCs in there was it looked for any invocation of a CMD.exe. And I was kind of saying, well, why did we alert on that? And the explanation is, well, how many people do you know, other than us and admins, ever drop to a command prompt? I'm like, oh, fair point. So any command prompt would be flagged on the system and says, hey, go look at this. It doesn't mean it's evil. It just basically says you should look at this a little bit closer just to validate what was going on in that host at that point in time. And again, for executing remote services, you have the SC command on the source side, which again, you see the registry and file system. But on the remote side, there's a massive amount of event logs that are created. You end up seeing in the shim cache, evil.exe, what the service name of the executable that is going to be executed at that point, and others that we're going to have tied to it. And again, what we're really trying to do here is like things you could look for. Even though clean one of these up, are they able to clean all of these locations up if they're performing anti-forensics, trying to hide from you? It becomes, more and more difficult, not impossible, but difficult to achieve. Here's again some additional ones for doing scheduled tasks. Scheduled tasks also has multiple different event logs that you're going to be looking for here. The security event log you obviously see on the remote side, but you also see the task scheduler maintenance. Also have an echo event. And the reason we mention these secondary event logs is the security event log is the event log that is high rotation, meaning that your horizon view, temporal horizon view, is only going to be able to go back, I don't know, depending on how much activity you have. And if you have a lot of activity on a single system, then it's not going to, you're not forwarding every event log and every security event log back to the SIM. So it's one of the reasons why to increase your security event log as large as possible. But if you wanted to extend your temporal horizon view, these secondary log files, which record the same information in them, potentially have a much longer horizon view, temporal horizon view, that you'd be able to extend back even further than what you get for the security. So even though it's replicative data, you take a look at both in there. And again, the software, registry keys, the shim cache, the file system, you start to see a lot of repetitiveness in here for these different locations. And again, on the source system, how many people do you know drop to a command prompt to do scheduled tasks? Typically, even administrators, in many cases, use Windows R and do it through, the GUI scheduler rather than dropping in and trying to do it from the command prompt. I'm not saying everyone, but again, it's more of a from what we have typically seen that's out there. Mike, you wanted to take WMI. This one is fascinating.
It really is, and obviously feel free to please jump in and anything you see that you want to talk on. But I just love this topic. I think it's really, really interesting, and because it can be used for so many different things. And first and foremost, it's been around for so long, and it's enabled by default. So it's been around, I think, installed in the beginning of Windows 2000, but there were installers for back as far as like Windows 95 and Windows NT. So, I mean, the technology's been there for a long time, and it has basically its hooks into everything about the operating system. So we can effectively query basically anything about the operating system, and we can take action on anything that occurs on the operating system. So, obviously the red teamers, the attackers have taken note of this and, begun to use WMI pretty effectively, and making it very difficult in some cases to actually discover what they're doing. Part of the reason is because most of the artifacts with WMI aren't really stored in a typical location. They're not stored in separate files. They're actually stored in a database, which we'll talk about a little bit on the next slide when we get to kind of what happens on the destination. But from the source system, if we look at WMI, a couple different ways of invoking it is the command line version of WMI, the WMIC command. which many of you are probably familiar with. I've used it many different times for my own, discovery on remote systems, looking to see, you can query everything from like, is a system, what type of what a chassis type is it? You can actually figure out what the chassis type is. In other words, is it a laptop or a desktop, which I would use in some cases to figure out, is it likely going to be restarted, taken off the network if it's a laptop, or is it going to stay online? Things of that nature. But at any rate, from an attacker's perspective, what they're probably most interested in, at least initially, and we're talking in this section about kind of process execution, is invoking a command on the remote system. So towards the top there, you see WMIC/node host. So you specify the remote host. You can specify an alternate user here, which if we look at the event logs, this is where the 4648 comes into play, and we see an alternate user account being launched or invoked. And then it's simply the directive there, process call create, and you provided a path to what process you're going to launch. Very, very simple. It just kicks off the process, so it's kind of a poor man's PSEXEC. You don't get any feedback from it, but if the process was there and the user that was connecting to the remote host had administrative rights, then it will kick off that process. So it does require admin rights on the remote box to launch. The second instance there is basically doing the exact same thing, but via PowerShell and effectively over WinRM. And does it actually, because it's PowerShell, will result in a lot of different artifacts, which we'll talk about in the next section here. So we'll come back to the PowerShell aspect of it. But from a source side, if we're talking about strictly kind of WMIC, then you've got the standard evidence of execution there, the shim cache, BAM DAM, kind of a newer feature that's in the latest version of Windows 10, and AMCache as well, recording WMIC executing. And then on the file system, the prefetch there as well. On the destination side, that's where it starts to get pretty interesting. And this is where we start to be able to figure out, what may have occurred, what type of activity was launched on the remote system. So on the event logs, you've got the WMI activity operational event logs is really, really useful. There's a lot of detail in there about invoking WMI against remote host. Now, WMI is there for managing your environment. And so you're going to see quite a bit in most environments, you're going to see quite a bit of, relevant and, legitimate use of WMI and WMI priv.exe. This WMI priv.exe, we kind of have highlighted at the top, that is kind of the listening service effectively, or listening process that actually runs the WMI commands. So when WMI is used by the attacker or legitimately, you're going to see WMI priv.se get kicked off. Now, what's kind of cool is if we look at those event logs, that WMI activity operational, that 5857 event, it's almost like a process tracking event log just for WMI or WMI priv.se. Every time you have a remote WMI command launched against this target or destination system, you're gonna have an event show up in that event log that shows essentially that it was launched and what DLL was run. In other words, which of the WMI providers, which provides the code for WMI, was launched. Now, in some cases, attackers will install their own malicious WMI provider, so that could be interesting in that aspect. But if nothing else, you just get basically a timeline of WMI being run against the system. The other events in there that we kind of highlighted, the 5860 and 5861, are essentially the temporary and the permanent event consumers. The idea behind event consumers is essentially we can use, well, attackers can use WMI in a couple of different ways. We've been talking about they can launch processes on the remote system, but also they can set up persistence mechanisms. And that's done essentially by developing these kind of event consumers where the operating system is constantly watching all these different events on the system, and you can set up a link between a particular event happening and a resulting action occurring. So that action could be a process launching or a script launching or things of that nature. And so that's kind of the persistence piece of the puzzle that comes in with WMI as well, kind of gluing those two things together. Now, historically, what's glued those two things together, if we kind of move over to the registry side and even the file system, we talk about this MOF comp, and in the file system file creation, we talk about evil.mof. So these MOF files are stored in the directory with WMI, which is the WMI. It's kind of on the far right there, Windows System 32 WBEM directory. You get these MOF files and the provider DLLs. And they work together to essentially, well, the MOF files particularly work together to kind of set up a persistence mechanism. And they register themselves into the WMI database. The WMI database is in this repository directory where a file called objects.data exists. And that is essentially, when we talk about storing things in WMI, that's where it's stored, is in that registry, or sorry, in that database file. So you can have these persistence mechanisms that are looking for particular events, and then it'll launch an action. Well, all that information is stored in this repository database, this objects.data. There have been instances, particularly APT29 has been shown to do this, where they're actually storing data as well as persistence mechanisms. They'll create their custom classes and they'll actually just write data into this database. So it's almost like a fileless mechanism to store data as well as to provide persistence. And then originally how we got to this whole topic was literally using WMIC to remotely execute a process. So WMI is like, just to me, is really a fascinating subject, and we could go super deep into this. I just kind of recommend too that if you haven't spent much time with it, definitely do a little research here, and a simple Google search of WMI forensics will turn up lots of different interesting presentations. For example, the folks at Mandiant or FireEye have got a nice repository on GitHub where they've got some of their articles and some of their tools. In fact, a tool to parse out that objects.data database. So definitely look into that, and several presentations you can watch as well. So Rob, do you have anything you want to add, or should we got one more subject there? We'll talk about PowerShell remoting. So PowerShell remoting is another one that's just pretty fascinating to me. It's got a lot of capability, obviously, from an administrative standpoint. That's the goal of PowerShell remoting is to make administrative work more efficient and effective. It scales extremely effectively, but for all these great powers that we use for administrative purposes, the attackers can use them for offensive purposes as well. So if we just get down into the nuts and bolts of what's happening with PowerShell and PowerShell remoting, what are the artifacts that are left behind? There's a lot. There's a whole lot. Looking at the event logs in particular, on the left there, you got, well, first off, on a lot of these, we're talking about using alternate credentials and the security event logs recording of 4648, which is one of the most incredible events that I've ever encountered, because it can literally show you each of the accounts that the attacker is using and what remote systems they're using it against. It's just incredibly cool to utilize that event log. And of course, attackers are often, getting higher level privileges and using those other credentials to do it. But at any rate, when we get into the kind of the PowerShell event logs and the WinRM, which supports PowerShell remoting event logs, the long and short of it is we get a tremendous amount of logging here, both on the source and the destination. And if you look through these source items, you'll see multiple logs here that are tracking sessions being created, session being closed, the user account that was used for that session, and even the target IP address and or host name. So really cool information there, and it was almost hard to get all the event logs that were captured by default into this poster. We really just had to kind of narrow it down to what's most useful there. On the registry side, it's again, kind of we're talking about more or less PowerShell executable itself being launched, and if that's the case, then obviously you've got a lot of these evidence of execution artifacts being populated. And on the file system, if PowerShell.exe is being run, and particularly with PowerShell scripts like PS1 files, well, often those will be launched kind of with PowerShell, and so you'll get those cataloged inside the prefetch file itself. And then also what's interesting is with PowerShell version 5, we now have a command history up to the past 4,096 commands. It's actually maintained on a per user basis in a plain text file in the path we show there. So that could be really useful as well if the attacker had kind of interactive access. Now, on the destination side, we get a ton of events as well. The event logs, again, we've got kind of, not to be discounted, we've got the fact that an attacker essentially is using compromised accounts to log into the host, with administrative access in almost every case. So you've got the 4624 showing that they logged in and the 4672 showing they had admin rights. But then we get, again, some of these Windows PowerShell as well as Windows remoting event logs. And one thing that was really interesting in testing is this idea that some of these scripts are actually going to be captured in these event logs. Now, beginning with Windows PowerShell version 5, Microsoft, by design, started capturing suspicious scripts in the operational event log, the one on the bottom left there. So the Windows PowerShell operational event log is going to have some of your more kind of, egregious scripts that are going to be doing things like keystroke logging or other things of that nature that are going to be flagged by Microsoft as suspicious. So you'll get those scripts without having to enable any additional logging. You can, of course, and it's recommended to actually log all scripts, and that's been around since, I believe, version 3 of PowerShell. Those PowerShell operational also record the authenticating users coming in. But what I found was interesting with testing too is that if we go up to the PowerShell, the Windows PowerShell logs, so separate from the operational logs, there's actually another capability to capture the scripts. And it was kind of hit or miss, and I can't tell you exactly why. Sometimes it captured it and other times it didn't. But what I can tell you is some of my testing was with the Kanza framework. And those are PS1 scripts that'll, query a remote host. And in some cases, it basically captured the entire script, including even the comments of the script, which is cool. And this was in a PowerShell event log, that event ID 800. So definitely something to keep in mind there. And so, just kind of moving over in the registry, we've got, the WSM prov host. This is very much like what we talked about with PowerShell, as well as, or sorry, not PowerShell, WMI, as well as PSEXEC for that matter. They kind of have a hosting process that executes the commands. And so for WinRM more generically, it's this WSM prov host. So if Windows remoting is not something, or even the WinRM service more generically is not something that you're typically using in your environment, and you see that process launching, then that's absolutely something you want to dig into. And then often what they're doing is launching additional executables, maybe some kind of command and control, so you find an evil.exe or some type of malware that goes along with it. They may also be implementing some of their PowerShell scripts that have to bypass restrictions. And unfortunately for them, unfortunately for us, it's trivial to just bypass any restrictions on the PowerShell execution policy, but you can find that in the software registry hive, so something to kind of keep in mind and look for. And then on the file system, we've got any new files that are brought over through PowerShell remoting, as well as the idea that if they went to the next level, which is essentially enter PS session, and that gives you effectively like an SSH style connection to the remote host, then many times that'll create an entire profile for that user account on the remote box. So as we're tracking, compromised accounts, looking for those compromised accounts and those profiles on unsuspecting or unusual hosts, then that's something we want to be kind of keeping an eye out for.
One additional thing that I would say on both of these, between PowerShell as well as the WMI one, is that most of the time that you end up seeing these artifacts that exist on a system is primarily due to an adversary doing it. I mean, you go back to how often do you think someone is doing a remote PowerShell naturally against a standard user system in the environment? And the answer to that question is unlikely. On servers, yes. On critical systems, yes. But how often do you see Jill and Joe, using that example again, where Jill is doing remote PowerShell or remote WMI commands from her system to another user system. So when you're creating heat maps, and what a really useful hunting technique is to potentially scan your environment, avoid the servers, but scan just different enclaves, looking for where natural occurrences of this stuff are happening, and then kind of validate those and then kind of monitor that over time. If you see a lot of the WSIM-prop hosts, or on the couple pages back here when we talk about the WMIPR VSE, again, highly unlikely Jill and Joe are launching PowerShell commands and WMI commands between one another system. And it's also equally unlikely that you're going to have a remote administrator do something that directed against it. Now, obviously, like things like Hansa or even your own footprints, you might have to recognize you're using PowerShell to do hunting in the first place. You have to eliminate that a little bit. But the main idea is that how often do you think normal users are potentially communicating like this from system A to system B? Do a heat map, kind of analyze this from a hunting perspective and see what is the likelihood kind of crop up here. So that's it for the official poster. I'm hoping that if you've written down how to get the poster, it's the link that's down in the lower right-hand side of most of our screens here. We want to take a couple extra minutes and answering any additional questions that folks may have, but we really appreciate you attending the webcast with us today, or tonight if you're overseas. And I hope you enjoy the brand new poster. If you find anything that you would like to see adjusted, or find a mistake in it or something, please email Mike or I, or just Twitter DM us, and we'll have you make those adjustments. Nothing's perfect. We're always looking for improvements and advice on how we can make it even better.